On the 5th of December 1961, a commuter train smashed through the border between East Germany and West Berlin. But as it turns out, this wasn't an accident. The driver had essentially hijacked the train, and this was a very carefully planned escape. This is the story of how train driver Harry Deterling managed to get himself, his family, and several friends across the border into freedom. Germany in 1961 was a divided country. West Germany, officially the Federal Republic of Germany, was aligned with the US during the Cold War, while East Germany, officially the German Democratic Republic, was aligned with the Soviet Union. And of course, like most countries with the word democratic in their names, East Germany was not democratic. Berlin, though, was in a unique position. It was located inside East Germany, but was itself divided into two halves. West Berlin, which was a kind of a city-state but dependent on West Germany, and East Berlin, which was the capital of East Germany. I'm missing out a lot of details here, of course. Obviously, the reality was a lot more complicated. I'm just explaining as much as you need to know in order to understand the story. West Berlin was a big problem for East Germany. As the East German regime became increasingly authoritarian and people noticed that the standard of living was way higher in the West, East Germans could simply drive to East Berlin, sneak across the border into West Berlin, and either stay there or fly out to West Germany. East Germany put a stop to that in August 1961 by very heavily fortifying the border all the way around West Berlin. But West Berlin wasn't completely cut off. It was still connected to West Germany by designated air, road, and rail corridors that were kept heavily guarded and under surveillance. You might notice that there are parts where the border doesn't quite follow the original city limits of Berlin. And this is because when Germany was divided into occupation zones, the British and the Soviets organized a land swap to give the British occupying forces control of a military airfield at Gatow. But this meant that a few parts of West Berlin ended up inside East Germany, and that included a residential area called Albrechtshof. And Albrechtshof is the setting for our story. It was through Albrechtshof that the main Berlin to Hamburg railway line went, and this was now one of the rail corridors to West Germany, with just a few so-called interzone trains every day. But also, of course, the construction of the Berlin Wall disrupted local train services, as West Berlin was no longer accessible to East German trains. Fortunately, the East Germans had already constructed an outer orbital line that allowed trains to be routed around West Berlin. Harry Deterling was one of the train drivers operating commuter trains in the region, but he had just been told that he would not be allowed to continue his career. You see, he had refused to sign a declaration saying that he approved of the building of the Berlin Wall. As a result, he had been informed that in the new year he would be transferred to work in a brickyard for 1 mark a day, and that he would be subjected to political re-education. The East German regime did not have a very high tolerance for people who formed their own opinions. Now, back in those days, steam trains were still in regular use, and Deterling drove trains similar to this one. Now, a steam locomotive needs a crew of 2, a driver, obviously, and a fireman whose job it was to keep the fire burning. And one of Deterling's colleagues, a young fireman named Hartmut Lichy, had a similar problem with the regime. He was to be forced into military service against his will. The two of them came up with a plan to escape in a train. And they would do it at Albrechtshof, a place that Deterling chose because he happened to know that it wasn't quite secure. At the border, there was a gate that was normally closed, but was opened by guards to let interzone trains pass. This gate was enough to stop people getting through, but stood no chance against a steam locomotive. According to a panicked report submitted to the East German government the day after the incident, it had previously been decided against further security measures to avoid endangering the interzone trains. But the same report also complained that one simple security measure could have been made, although it didn't specify what that was. So the plan was to get themselves onto a train bound for Albrechtshof, but just simply smash through the gate into West Berlin. And Deterling could even bring his family and friends as passengers. This was a plan that was every bit as risky as you're probably thinking right now. They were originally going to do this between Christmas and New Year, but Deterling discovered that the crossing at Albrechtshof was to be closed down completely, and interzone trains would instead be rerouted through the crossing point at Griebnitz, which was a lot more secure. So they had to bring the date forward, and there was still a couple of things to consider. Most importantly, the line that they would be on was at the time a single track line. There was a second track at Albrechtshof station itself, but any train travelling on that track in the direction of Berlin would always be guided back onto the main line, even if the points were incorrectly set. Deterling had to study the timetables very carefully to make sure that he wasn't in danger of running head-on into an interzone train leaving Berlin. The plan involved running through a stop signal, and even steam trains at the time had systems that would bring them to a halt if they tried to do that. But, and as a train driver, Deterling of course knew this, the trackside infrastructure needed to make the system work had been removed by the Soviets and taken as war reparations. Getting assigned to a suitable train would take a couple of tricks. Deterling reported for extra unpaid shifts, something that workers in East Germany were very strongly encouraged to do. After all, everyone had a patriotic duty to help create the glorious socialist paradise that they'd all been promised. And it paid off. He was scheduled to drive a passenger train from his hometown of Oranienburg to Nauen, where it would reverse and terminate at Albrechtshof, except of course that he had no intention of terminating there. And this would happen in the evening of the 5th of December, which coincidentally was the day before his 28th birthday. His family and friends made their ways to different stations along the route so that they wouldn't attract attention by all getting on at the same time. There were about 24 of them. Meanwhile, Deterling reported for duty and told the fireman that had actually been assigned for that journey, "It's okay, you can go home. You've been given the evening off." And so Lichy was able to take over as fireman, and the train set off. One family almost didn't make it. They actually missed the train and had to take a taxi to the last stop before Albrechtshof. But they got there, and they were the last to board the train for the most exciting and most dangerous ride of their lives. The train failed to stop at Albrechtshof and instead kept going back onto the main line and through the stop signal. Deterling accelerated the train, sounded the whistle, and then he and Lichy took cover in the tender in case they were shot at. Meanwhile, the passengers who were in the know dived to the floor and hoped that their luggage would stop any bullets. The conductor and a couple of passengers pulled the emergency brakes, but nothing happened. Deterling had sabotaged them. Fortunately for a whole lot of people, the guards were far too surprised to fire. The train came to a halt about 500 meters inside West Berlin, and everyone who was in on the plan immediately fled the train and disappeared into the night. Deterling found a phone to alert the West Berlin police. A few other passengers also took the chance to stay in West Berlin, but most walked back to the border. An interzone train from Hamburg had to wait for an hour and a half at Albrechtshof until the line was cleared. The immediate effect was that the Albrechtshof crossing was closed several days earlier than planned, and just to make sure, the tracks were removed. It was 1995 before the line was reconnected. Deterling was offered the chance to move to the United States, but declined. He couldn't, however, stay in Berlin. Even in West Berlin, the trains were actually operated by the East German Railway Company, and the East German government was apparently even trying to kidnap him. So just days later, he and his family were moved to West Germany, where they were given police protection and forced to move several times to avoid retribution. But he was able to continue his train driving career. He finally retired in 1989 and died in 2010 at the age of 76. The East German government, by the way, later described this event as a criminal attack on the interzone train from Hamburg. Well, what did you expect? Thanks for watching, and for more train-related content, check out the video I linked to down there.